But are the Watchers the same as demons? Not exactly. The Watchers themselves are bound, of course, is what Jude and 2 Peter both say. Like, they're in chains waiting for the final judgment. So they're not loose in the world, like running around. But their offspring, the Nephilim, the giants, died. But the widespread Second Temple Jewish tradition, which, First Enoch develops extensively, is that when the giant offspring of the Watchers died, their disembodied spirits persisted, and those disembodied spirits are what the New Testament would call demons or unclean spirits, beings that essentially seek a body to inhabit, so they inhabit different places and then people, and then these are connected to the dead giant bloodlines. Now that puts demons in a different category from the Babel sons of God. The ones who are governing the nations of Deuteronomy 32. Those are the tier 2 divine council members. Demons in this framework are something else entirely. The spiritual remnants of the Nephilim, who are disembodied and operating in the space that the Watchers left behind. The New Testament treats them as distinct categories, so it's kind of worth knowing the difference. But if that wasn't enough, the sons of God were just the pavement or road, if you will, for humanity's upcoming and right now depravity. And it all culminated in one particular spot. Which leads us to the third rebellion, which is the most significant for the rest of the Bible. Genesis 11. The whole earth at this point seemingly has one language. Humanity comes together and they're like, yeah, let us build ourselves a city with its tower, reaching the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves lest we dispersed over the whole earth. The idea of them wanting to reach the heavens wasn't about how tall their building was. We know what it likely was. It was likely a ziggurat, which was part of a temple complex or a temple complex itself. They wanted to get the gods to come to them, and they wanted to get God to come to them. Obviously, you can't put Yahweh in a cage, so God's response is, yeah, you guys are foolish. I'm going to scatter you. And so the languages are now confused, and that also means that the nations are now created. And of course, Deuteronomy 32:8-9, God assigns these scattered nations to the sons of God, each of them getting a governing divine being. But Israel, as we know, God takes for himself. That assignment that happens right there is the beginning of the longest storyline in the entire Old Testament, because the divine beings who receive those nations, as Psalm 22 will eventually tell us, become the gods of the nations that they worship, and they accept that worship. They lead the nations away from Yahweh. They become, in the language of the New Testament, as Paul talks about, the principalities and powers. Now, every encounter in the Old Testament has a new layer. When Israel fights the Canaanites, they're not just fighting humans as it's commonly seen. Everything was spiritual. When Elijah confronts the prophets of Baal, he's, you think it'd just be confronting a false religion, but it's more than that. When Daniel faces the court of Babylon, he's living inside a nation whose governing deity or governing being is actively opposed to Yahweh. And it is that conflict that is running underneath the entire historical narrative of the entire Bible. The three rebellions, they all escalate on one another. The one divine being in the garden, a group of divine beings corrupting humanity, and then an entire tier of divine council claiming the nations as their own. In Psalm 22, the prayer at the end, "Arise, O God, judge the earth, for you shall inherit all the nations," is the prayer that all three of those rebellions will be answered for and reversed. And just as you might think that this stops in the Old Testament because it was older, it doesn't. Because the New Testament, and Paul specifically, is operating entirely inside of this framework as well. In fact, he practically assumes it. Ephesians 6:12 says this, and maybe you've heard this passage or you've read it before, but "For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, the cosmic powers over this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places." The Greek words here for rulers and authorities and cosmic powers, and the spiritual forces in heavenly places, in the framework that we've been building, Paul is describing the structure of the divine council, specifically the rebellious tier 2 members, the sons of God, who were assigned to the nations and chose rebellion instead. Colossians 1:16 says that Christ created thrones and dominions or rulers and authorities, and all of these, the thrones, dominions, rulers, and authorities are the council members. Paul is saying that Christ created them and Christ rules over them. And just a chapter later, he says that Jesus disarmed the rulers and authorities and put them to open shame by triumphing over them. The cross was the decisive moment where God is reclaiming the nations. The ruling powers of the divine council that have been claimed by the nations are completely disarmed of their authority at the cross. None of the rulers of this age understood this, for if they had, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. So the rulers of this age did not understand what they were doing when they orchestrated the crucifixion. They thought they were winning. They were in fact not. Then comes the end, when he delivers the kingdom to God the Father after destroying every rule and every authority and power, for he must reign until he has put all enemies under his feet. Formerly, when you did not know God, you were enslaved to those that by nature are not gods. The Galatians, before even the gospel, were Gentiles, so they were under the administration of the divine beings assigned assigned to them. Paul is literally saying that you were living under the corrupted authority of the sons of God from Deuteronomy 32. The elementary principles, stoicheia, I think that's how I pronounce that, he uses in Galatians 4 verse 3 and Colossians 2 verse 8, likely refers to those same governing powers. Paul has a specific cosmology and understanding of the spiritual world, and the divine council is the foundation for it. Now, this part absolutely amazed me when I first learned about it. Watch what happens at Pentecost in Acts 2, knowing everything that I just told you now. All of the people gather from all the nations in Jerusalem, and the Holy Spirit falls on the gathered disciples. They begin speaking in other languages. They begin speaking in tongues. And Luke gives us a specific list of nations present who hear them. Parthians, Medes, Elamites, residents of Mesopotamia, Judea, Cappadocia, Pontus, Asia, Phrygia, Pamphylia, Egypt, Libya, Cyrene, Rome, Crete, and Arabia. Now, go read Genesis 10. The table of nations after Babel. The list of peoples dispersed across the earth when the nations were created. Why do you think Luke was mentioning those specific nations? The nations that were scattered at Babel, distributed to the sons of God, are being addressed simultaneously with the gospel in their own languages. And remember, at the Tower of Babel, the nations were divided languages, so now you have the disciples who are speaking in tongues, which were known languages, at Pentecost, and they preach the gospel to all the nations that came into attendance. The reversal of Babel begins at Pentecost. So then what happens after that? Well, here's where it gets even more amazing. Because if you believe, as Paul clearly does, that the nations are under corrupted divine administration from the Babel incident, then the preaching of the gospel to all the nations is going to very, very, very specific people. In Paul's missionary journeys, red on a map move consistently west, and that trajectory follows the table of nations in Genesis 10. The peoples who spread into what we now call the Middle East, into Turkey, into Greece, into Europe, they are called the Japhetite branch. And then look at Acts 13 onward. Paul starts in Antioch, Syria, the Semitic world near the original Babel region, and then he goes to Cyprus, and then Galatia, which is central Turkey, and then Asia Minor, Ephesus, Lystra, Derbe, and then it turns west into Greece to Philippi, Thessalonica, Corinth, and then Rome. Each stop is a nation, or rather a territory of a nation, from the Genesis 10 table. Each place that the gospel takes root is a place being reclaimed from the divine being who was assigned to it at the Tower of Babel. And Paul knows this. How do we know that? Because Acts 16, the Spirit prevents Paul from going into Asia and then prevents him from entering Bithynia. And then Paul has a vision of a man of Macedonia saying, come over here to Macedonia and help us. He's being directed by the Spirit to move the mission to the west, into the coastal nations at the edge of the known world. And if that's not enough to show that Paul knew exactly what he was doing, he amazingly articulates his own missionary strategy explicitly in Romans 15. And this is remarkable. He tells us exactly what he's doing and why he's doing it. Let me read you Romans 15, 18 through 24. From Jerusalem and all the way around to Illyricum, I have fulfilled the ministry of the gospel of Christ. He's describing a specific geography here, from Jerusalem, which is the center of the Israelite world, all the way around to Illyricum, which is roughly modern-day Croatia and Albania. He's covered the eastern side. He says, I no longer have any room to work in these regions. Not that there's not more people to reach. Obviously there are. He means he established the gospel presence in the major centers of those nations. But now, since I no longer have any room for work in these regions, and since I have longed for many years to come to you, I hope to see you in passing as I go to Spain.